Zambia's opposition wasted their biggest chance, the Post-Lungu disaster explained. When Edgar Lungu left office, Zambia stood at a crossroads. The nation hoped for a smooth transition, strong leadership, and a clear path forward. But instead, the opposition stumbled. Opportunities were missed, alliances fractured, and political momentum slipped away. Tonight, we uncover exactly how Zambia's opposition squandered the Post-Lungu moment and why it still matters for 2026. Good day, viewers. Welcome to another edition of the InspirAfrica Official. I'm Nakash. I hope you've all been keeping well this week. It's been quite a turbulent period across southern Africa, but today we're focusing on a story that's been unfolding in Zambia, a story that many believe will define the nation's political future for years to come. Today's lead story: Zambia's opposition wasted their biggest chance, the Post-Lungu disaster explained. Imagine this. A once mighty opposition movement, united by years of struggle against authoritarian overreach, finally achieves the impossible. They topple an entrenched government. The people celebrate in the streets. Hope fills the air. Democracy, it seems, has won, but what happens when the victors become the very thing they fought against? What happens when the promise of change curdles into the same old patterns of power, patronage, and political persecution? What happens when the heroes of yesterday become the villains of today, and the people who could have stopped them simply stood by and watched? This is the story of Zambia's opposition after Edgar Lungu. A story of squandered opportunities, betrayal from within, and a democracy left gasping for air. How did the very forces that fought so hard to remove an authoritarian leader end up becoming complicit in the erosion of the very freedoms they once championed? Why did those who promised to defend democracy stand silent as the new government dismantled the press, intimidated critics, and consolidated power? And what does it mean for Zambia's future when the opposition, given the perfect storm of public discontent, economic collapse, and mass disillusionment, failed so spectacularly to offer a credible alternative? These are the questions that haunt Zambian politics today. And the answers? They paint a devastating picture of wasted potential, internal chaos, and a nation left searching for real leadership. Factual foundation. The revelation came to light in the aftermath of the 2021 Zambian general elections, a contest that should have been the opposition's crowning moment, but instead exposed deep fractures that had been festering for years. To understand this disaster, we must go back to 2016, when Edgar Lungu of the Patriotic Front narrowly won re-election amid controversy. His administration, marred by economic mismanagement, rising debt, and allegations of corruption, should have been vulnerable. The copper-dependent economy was struggling, the kwacha had depreciated dramatically, and load shedding had become a daily reality for millions of Zambians. By 2018, warning signs were everywhere. The International Monetary Fund had raised red flags about Zambia's debt sustainability. Civil society organizations documented increasing restrictions on press freedom and political space. The stage was set for a united opposition to capitalize on widespread discontent. But instead of unity, what emerged was chaos. In early 2020, as Zambia prepared for the 2021 elections, the opposition landscape was fragmented into more than a dozen parties. The United Party for National Development, led by Hakainde Hichilema, was the largest opposition force. This was Hichilema's sixth attempt at the presidency. But rather than rallying behind the most viable challenger, several opposition figures chose to run their own campaigns. Chishimba Kambwili, once a firebrand within the ruling PF, had broken away to form the National Democratic Congress. Edith Nwakwe led the Forum for Democracy and Development. Fred Membi, the veteran journalist, established the Socialist Party. Each had their own vision, their own grievances, and their own ambitions. The critical moment came in March 2021, 6 months before the election, when attempts to form an opposition alliance collapsed spectacularly. Despite weeks of negotiations facilitated by church leaders and civil society groups, the parties could not agree on a single candidate or even a coalition framework. Kambwili accused Hichilema of arrogance and refused to step aside. Membi declared that Zambia needed a revolutionary alternative, not what he termed recycled politicians. Nwakwe insisted her party would only join a coalition if she was given significant ministerial positions in advance, a demand that was immediately rejected. Direct evidence. The testimony from those alliance negotiations reveals the depth of the dysfunction. In a radio interview on Hot FM in April 2021, Chishimba Kambwili explained his refusal to support Hichilema. You see, the problem with HH is that he thinks he owns the opposition. He thinks that just because UPND is the biggest party, everyone should just bow down and follow him. But I have principles. I have a constituency that elected me. How can I tell my people, sorry, vote for this man who has lost 5 times before? It doesn't make sense. When the interviewer pressed him about whether defeating the PF was more important than individual ambitions, Kambwili's response was telling. Look, defeating PF is important, yes. But replacing them with what? With someone who was going to be a puppet of the same economic interests that have been exploiting Zambia? No. If Zambians want real change, they need to vote for me, not for these businessmen who are they're just in it for themselves. Fred Membia's position was equally uncompromising. In a Socialist Party press conference in May 2021, he stated, "The question before Zambians is not simply whether to remove the Patriotic Front. The question is what kind of Zambia we want to build." And I can tell you, very categorically, that the UPND represents the same neoliberal capitalist agenda that has impoverished our people for decades. So why would the Socialist Party, which stands for a fundamental transformation of our economic system, why would we endorse more of the same? It would be a betrayal of everything we stand for. When a journalist asked whether he was concerned that splitting the opposition vote would hand victory to the PF, Membi became animated. This is the old thinking, you see. This is the thinking that keeps us trapped in this false binary of PF versus UPND. Zambians deserve a real choice. They deserve a party that will nationalize the mines, that will redistribute wealth, that will break the power of the comprador bourgeoisie. If we compromise on these principles just to win an election, then what have we won? Nothing. We've won nothing. The most damaging testimony came from Laura Mitty, a prominent civil society activist who had attempted to mediate the alliance talks. In an interview with Zambia Reports in June 2021, she described the negotiations. It was honestly heartbreaking. You had a room full of people who all claimed to want the same thing, to remove the PF and restore democracy in Zambia. But none of them was willing to make the necessary sacrifices. I remember one meeting where we spent 3 hours arguing about the order in which the party leaders would be listed on the alliance letterhead. Can you imagine? The country is collapsing, and we're arguing about letterhead. Mitty continued, HH, to his credit, was willing to offer significant concessions. He said he would give cabinet positions, he would support other candidates in local elections, he would even share campaign resources. But it was never enough. Kambwili wanted to be vice president. Membi wanted policy guarantees that were simply not realistic. Nawakwi wanted, I don't even know what Nawakwi wanted, to be honest. It changed every meeting. When asked who she blamed for the failure, Mitty sighed audibly, I blame all of them. But mostly I blame the small party leaders who absolutely knew they had no chance of winning, but refused to step aside. They chose their egos over the country. And Zambians paid the price. Deeper analysis. The implications of this fragmentation extended far beyond the immediate election. From a strategic standpoint, the opposition's disunity fundamentally misunderstood Zambia's electoral system. With a first-past-the-post system requiring no runoff, every vote for a minor candidate was effectively a vote removed from the most viable challenger. Political analyst Sishiwa noted that in the 2016 election, Lungu had won with just 50.35% of the vote. A margin of approximately 100,000 votes. The combined vote share of minor opposition candidates exceeded 200,000. The math was simple, unity could have changed the outcome. But the 2021 situation was more complex. Ironically, despite the opposition's continued fragmentation, Hichilema won decisively, capturing 59.02% of the vote compared to Lungu's 38.33%. This landslide victory came not because the opposition united, but because the PF's support had collapsed so dramatically that even a divided opposition could prevail. This raises a troubling question: did the opposition squander their biggest chance, or did circumstances bail them out of their own incompetence? Opposition MP Jack Muyimbu offered this perspective in a parliamentary debate in September 2021: "We won despite ourselves. Make no mistake about that. The Zambian people rejected the PF so overwhelmingly that our divisions didn't matter." But what about next time? What happens when we face a more competent opponent? What happens when the margins are narrower? We cannot rely on our opponent's failures forever. Legal scholar O'Brien Kaba raised broader concerns about what the opposition's behavior revealed about Zambian political culture. The alliance negotiations exposed a fundamental problem in our politics: the cult of personality and the weakness of institutions. These parties exist primarily as vehicles for individual ambitions rather than as programmatic organizations with clear ideologies. When you have that kind of political culture, coalition building becomes almost impossible because there's no shared framework, no shared principles to negotiate around. It's just competing egos. From an international perspective, the opposition's dysfunction was particularly striking given regional context. In Malawi in 2020, opposition parties had successfully formed the TANS Alliance, which united behind a single candidate and defeated the incumbent. In Kenya, the opposition had repeatedly formed coalitions, most recently the Azimio la Umoja movement. Why couldn't Zambian opposition parties achieve similar cooperation? Some analysts point to ethnic and regional divisions that, while less pronounced than in some neighboring countries, still influence Zambian politics. Hichilema's support base in southern and western provinces, Kambwili's northern province constituency, and Membia's appeal to urban intellectuals and students reflected different demographic and geographic coalitions that were difficult to merge. Others emphasize ideological differences that, while often exaggerated for political purposes, did represent genuine policy disagreements. The UPND's business-friendly, market-oriented approach was genuinely at odds with the Socialist Party's radical redistributive agenda. Whether these differences justified separate campaigns is debatable, but they were not entirely artificial. Perhaps the most troubling aspect was the reaction within the opposition itself after the 2021 victory. Rather than learning from their near disaster and building sustainable coalition mechanisms, opposition parties largely continued as before. Some small parties dissolved or became dormant, but the fundamental dynamics, personality-driven organizations, weak institutions, limited cooperation, remained unchanged. Former Cabinet Minister Edith Nwakwe, in a reflection published in the Mass newspaper in December 2021, acknowledged, "We got lucky. The PF was so unpopular, so discredited, that we couldn't lose. But we didn't deserve to win, not based on how we conducted ourselves. And if we don't learn from this, if we don't build real party structures and learn to work together, we'll be back where we started when the pendulum swings again. Because it always swings." The question of accountability also loomed large. In a functional democratic system, party leaders who make strategic errors face consequences. They lose primaries, are removed by party structures, or are replaced by more effective leaders. But in Zambia's opposition parties, accountability mechanisms were weak or non-existent. Leaders who had lost multiple elections remained in charge. Parties that consistently underperformed continued to split votes. There was no institutional process for course correction. This raises uncomfortable questions about Zambian democracy more broadly. If opposition parties cannot organize themselves effectively, cannot build sustainable institutions, cannot put national interest above personal ambition, what does that suggest about the country's democratic maturity? Are these simply growing pains of a young democracy, or signs of more fundamental dysfunction? Part 5, Closing. Thank you so much for watching another edition of InspirAfrica Official. The story of Zambia's opposition fragmentation is ultimately a story about the gap between democratic aspirations and political reality. It's about the tension between individual ambition and collective action, between ideological purity and pragmatic compromise, between the personal and the national. What do you think? Were the small party leaders justified in maintaining their independence, or did they betray the opposition cause? Should Hichilema have done more to accommodate their demands? And looking forward, what can Zambian opposition parties do to build more effective coalitions? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Share your perspective. Let's continue this conversation about African democracy, political strategy, and the challenges of building effective opposition movements. Until next time, this is Nakash, and I'll see you in the next video. Stay inspired, Africa.